So welcome. We, Gandhi and CloudFlare, are putting this DNS meetup together. And basically just getting the conversation going on about DNS. It's basically its current state, its limitations, and getting the conversation started on possible future implementations or things that we could fix, other things we could look into. So without further ado, I will pass the mic over to Danny and to introduce Paul.
Of course. And is there the clicker anywhere?
Yes.
Is this on? Do people in the back hear me? Cool, cool, okay. Thanks. I lied. You don't get to see any more slides. So I'm very, very excited to introduce Paul Mockapetris. Paul, the internet would be very, very different today without Paul. Beyond inventing DNS, he built the first SMTP server. He served as the chair of the IETF. He's a member of the Internet Hall of Fame, and now he's the chief scientist at Threatstop. So, Paul, thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you, guys.
So the way we're going to do this is Q&A. We have, we have sections, but take them as light suggestions. Raise your hand when you have questions. It should be a good conversation. We're really excited that all of you like DNS as much as we do. So Paul, what was your first interaction with a computer?
It was an IBM 1620 at the Aero and Astro department at MIT.
And your first interaction with the internet?
I was sitting in a chair at UC Irvine and logging into a tip, which was part of the ARPANET. So there's always people that say the ARPANET was like prehistory of the internet. That's my point of view, which makes me unpopular with a bunch of the ARPANET guys. But at any rate, and then there's the web era perhaps. So, they're just like the different extinctions. But the one thing I remember about it is like about the second or third time I was sitting there in the chair typing away on this, and it was very cool, and the keyboard started moving away. It was my first California earthquake, and the building was tilting. And it was one of those tilting earthquakes, and I'm like rolling, and it was very good.
That's awesome.
It was much more impressive than the internet of the time.
So you invented DNS. How did it start?
There's two ways to look at it, one of which is I had been at ISI and doing some work on TCP and throughput and so forth, and there were all the smart people in the world of the internet who were doing that as well. And I was like, a grad student or something. So that wasn't going anywhere. So John Postel one day came in and said, hey, Paul, why don't you figure out a compromise between these 5 different research proposals? And so I pretty much ignored all 5 and did things according to my own way of doing it. People say, well, how did you get to do that? Or how did you get the job of designing the DNS? Nobody thought it was important. Okay, all the important people were busy working on things like, how do we send card images over a TCP connection? There's 80 columns, and like most of them are blank, so we ought to, they were working on stuff like that. But the real way the DNS came to be was an assemblage of ideas in my head that I got first from MIT at the Architecture Machine Group, where we had to work. It wasn't a famous enough project. Nicholas Negroponte wasn't famous yet, so we could only get a bunch of very little computers. So we hooked them together and made a network and a distributed system. And we didn't know we were doing computing research. We thought we were doing architecture. And then with working at Draper Labs on space systems that had to be redundant because you couldn't go up in orbit and get them back. That was the idea of redundancy and reliability. I worked at IBM, virtual machines, you had to make them work and so forth. And Dave Farber at the DCS project at UC Irvine. I just had this whole idea about how to build distributed systems that I had learned by trial and error. So when somebody said, hey, build a distributed system, I said, oh yes, okay. No, I know. I made the mistake at MIT about 2 levels of hierarchy. Never doing that again. And so forth. So that's where the DNA really came from, was all of those things.
That's so cool. What was the MVP of DNS? What was version 1?
Well, version 1 was on a PDP 10 because that was what computer researchers used at the time, and it was written in Pascal and assembly language. It had kind of a funny history because I needed a large memory space, and so they had these extended memory instructions, and so I was using them. And then one day I found out that I had to go debug the microcode because these instructions weren't working on the machine. But eventually we got past that. So, DNS started out as being on multiple PDP 10s. The thing that really spread it was the UC Berkeley implementation, bind. I always thought bind was invented at MIT because they like these recursive acronyms, that bind is never debugged. But actually, it was done mostly at UC Berkeley, and it got on the Berkeley Unix distribution tape, which spread it a lot. So in spite of the fact that the people at Stanford had a better implementation, the Berkeley people had the distribution, and so that spread things a lot.
Were there naysayers at the time, people who argued against DNS?
Oh, sure. There were lots of people that said this is much too complicated. I mean, I always tell people, my definition of a success is if you, in a new system, is if you create the new system and people go, oh my God, my head hurts, that's too complicated, and it'll barely get off the ground, blah, 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 blah. And then 5 years later, they come back and go, well, where's the security? I want this, I want that. Why didn't you put that in? There's some parts of when you're building a system that you have to do what you have to do today to get the thing off the ground, all right? And if we had fixed all of the things that people say are problems in the DNS today, in the original implementation, we'd still be writing the specs, and the OSI people would be running your internet.
Why do you think the DNS protocol won over all of the other proposals at the time?
Part of it is that, like I said, there was a distribution through the whole Unix community that was very powerful at the time. We would give people the specs. They didn't come out on nice engraved, wonderful printed sheets done by little Swiss people for lots of money. So it was very easy to be contagious. And I think the key ideas were the distribution, in the sense that everybody was going to be getting their own local area network or their own set of machines, and you don't want to have to call up SRI and say, hey, I want to add a new machine. I'm in Iowa, or I'm in Zimbabwe, or I'm in Japan. I don't want to have to call up SRI to add a new machine, particularly seeing as it only opened 9 to 5 California time, right? So being able to say, okay, you get this one registration, and then you can do whatever you want to register machines and set up your system. Your fate is in your own hands. Is a very powerful idea. So, the distribution was one of the two great ideas. The other great idea was the fact that we used the system to keep track of where its pieces were. In other words, first of all, we break it up into 100 million separately managed zones, but then we have the data in those zones such that you can find any piece, you can go anywhere. So there's the magic that makes it look like it's all together, and then there's the magic that chops it up into the million pieces. And those were the things that a lot of the competing systems didn't have. They said, oh, well, we'll just have static configuration tables about where you find the data. And I said, no, I won't do that. If the system can't manage its own distribution, it's not worth anything.
One of the biggest changes to DNS was the need of a security system. When did you first realize that there was a security threat to the current system of DNS, that there could be cache poisoning or man in the middle?
Well, as far as I know, the first instance of cache poisoning was like 1987 or 88, and it was just due to Murphy rather than, some assailant. So the first instances of DDoS and cache poisoning that I know of were due to, human error. Okay, and so at the time, I put things. People say, "Well, Paul, you didn't figure this out." There's a quote that I had that said, "Don't cache anything just because somebody sends it to you." And people say, "Well, that wasn't explicit enough direction." And maybe it wasn't, but DDoS and cache poisoning have been around since the late '80s.
The current solution to this is DNSSEC. Why did DNSSEC take so long to implement?
Well, I've often said that DNSSEC was a nice 5-year project. I think that there's several choices that were made, and it's a little bit more complicated than it needed to be. And then some of the stuff is just hard. I'm probably not giving them sufficient credit. It was probably a nice 10-year project. But wait, where are we now? It's just too complicated for its own good.
With DNSSEC, we get these really large packets that are used for amplification. What do you think needs to be done about those?
Well, you can do amplification. You can do attacks with NTP as well, right? So it's not just a DNS problem.
Okay.
The sad thing is that what you end up doing is doing resource allocation of one sort or another and getting back to, sort of almost virtual circuit kind of technology. So I suspect there's somebody, bright guy out here that has a better solution. Right now, when I look at it, it's like that. It really pisses me off that I can't use datagrams anymore. I mean, it seems to me, I hear all these people about, well, we'll just send it over HTTP, whatever. I don't know. I should think that we should be able to use datagrams in our networks. That would, it's like should be a, Second Amendment right. The right to keep and bear datagrams.
Now that integrity is solved in DNS, what do you think needs to be done about privacy and DNS?
Well, that's kind of hard in the sense that I tend to think that DNS is a rather minor subtractor from your privacy. Your privacy was already pretty much gone.
What do you mean by that?
Do you use the web? Do you use PDFs? They're watching it. They're tracking you.
So you think it's a lost cause and DNS should not try to tackle the privacy problem?
Well, I think that if you're trying to figure out how to solve the privacy problem, there's sort of lower hanging fruit. DNS privacy, sure. I'm all for thinking about restructuring of DNS in various ways to add new capabilities, and maybe what it should be is a layer of names over opaque identifiers that aren't necessarily attributable and so forth and so on. But the people that get to watch a lot of the different networks are going to be able to watch traffic flows anyway. So I don't know. I bear the people that are doing DNS privacy no ill will. I think it's fine that they want to go do that, but I'm just saying, okay, suppose we had perfect DNS privacy. Would you still expect that every time you go and search Amazon for something, you don't start mysteriously getting ads for exactly that the next day? No, you will. So I think it's a lot deeper problem than just DNS.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the commercialization of DNS. You famously talk about this explosion of domains and commercialization of it as a move from DNS to DN $. Can you talk about what you mean by that?
Well, the innovation, when people spend $1/3 of $1 billion to contend for new top-level domains, there's a certain commercial interest that's evident, I would say, right? Especially since that's just the bidding to start the war, right? So, okay, it's a fairly big business. In my view, I thought experimentation with new names was delayed much too long. We have a couple of people here, myself included, we used to get phone calls. Hi, this is the current ruling elite of the DNS administration. People are asking us to expand the number of top-level domains, and we think that will impact the security and reliability and blah, blah, blah. And I said, no, why would adding 5 new top-level domains do that, or 10, or whatever? And then what happened was we added 200 country codes. DNS doesn't know what a country code is, right? So, okay, we added 200 country codes, and then people all of a sudden said, well, gee, if we can add 200 country codes, then maybe we can just change country code definitions so they could be up to 60 characters long, and then we could add new TLDs. How about that? It was obvious that you could add these new ones. And so for a long time, the technobabble denial of service attack was that, we'll severely impact the security and stability of the DNS, so we can't add TLDs. Then we had these 200 counterexamples, and then we had this big rush. And it would have been much better if we had done, I think, some experiments earlier rather than having, waiting to do 1,000 odd at their time. But, it is what it is. So I'm certainly in favor of doing that experiment, even though I would have liked something with a little less shock to the system.
Do you see any parallels between the conversation with GTLDs today and the ccTLDs then?
Somehow or another, why were the country code TLDs invented? It was partially so that Paul could say, hi, here's your own, go away, run it, it's yours, right? Once upon a time, the rule was that you could get a Yugoslavian domain name if only you promised to only use X400 for email. And I said, that's a fine rule. You run Yugoslavia however you would like, that's fine. The people in London thought that, we should obey international standards, so, they got the UK top-level domain, even though it was supposed to be GB according to international law, because there's this question about who owns Northern Ireland that is a little bit sensitive. At any rate, but they got to say that we don't do no stinking EDU, we have AC. We have the academic community instead of EDU, and that's fine, I don't care. So I think it's nice that everybody, initially it was good that these countries could run off and say, oh, we forbid the internet protocols and we'll, our domain is locked off. Okay, but it was a good way to distribute authority. And again, distributing authority is one of the two, main miracles.
Yeah. What are your thoughts about the GTLD expansion?
I wish I could see more examples of things where you just go, damn, that was a great idea. As far as I can tell, the places where people have, generally felt their life was better because of the new TLDs are almost like the fact that, Threatstop feels better because I have their logo on.
Right.
They like to identify with a particular community, and that's perfectly valid. Most T-shirts have slogans on them. Most geekware has, company IDs and so forth. So, if you want to have a great architecture, maybe you need a GTLD, but I don't know. I keep waiting for some, breakthrough where there's some GTLD that just is remarkably different and wonderful and so forth. Maybe people out there can explain it to me. Somebody out there have a great new GTLD? We haven't had a question from the audience yet.
No. Are there any questions?
All right.
I'm actually curious about the original TLDs and where do they come from, how that was mentioned.
I'm going to repeat the question into the mic for the live stream. Yeah, the question is curiosity about the original TLDs. Where did they come from? Why are they what they are?
Yeah, well, there was a bunch of this discussion that maybe I wasn't privy to, because remember, I was an unimportant person when I was designing this. Once upon a time, some very important people from the internet, you know them, one of them won a Turing Award. Sorry, giving something away. They suggested that the TLD should be the names of the phone companies. So we would have, TLD would be like AT&T or MCI or whatever. So there was that set of people. Well, come on. There's another set of people that said, oh my God, the international standards say that they have to be country codes. And so they have to be country codes because, this DNS thing will go away. And you're just here for this little transitory period, So to ease the transition to X500, we should use country codes because then there's less change to make. And then there was people like me that said, well, we don't really have to make the top level domains correspond to anything. We should, and so my goal all along from the technology was to say it could be whatever you wanted. 63 characters long, that seemed like enough. 63 octets. And so then we had more discussions, and so the phone company part went away a little bit, and it was now country codes. A lot of people were saying country codes, and Paul was going, no, I want other things other than other. I don't get to pick them even, but we should do other things. We should do some of these generic ones and so forth. So eventually they decided, well, okay, we'll try both. One of my favorite quotes from this era was somebody who said, well, all right, Paul, we'll let you do .com because nobody will use it.
Amazing.
And then that's .edu. How did that work out?
The question is, what about .edu? How did that happen?
Well, people at the time were still, a little bit rocky about this whole business about commercialization and so forth. So EDU was originally, for the educational. When you look at the growth of the internet, it started out network researchers, then maybe the educational research community, and then off into the commercial space and so forth. So, EDU is just for educational types. I seem to recall that I was in favor of EDU over some other alternative. The big question that people usually ask me is, okay, Paul, who invented .com? And I didn't. I didn't pick that particular three-letter string. And there's lots of people who have asked me, Paul, will you please say that I invented it? And I said, I don't remember, I'm sorry. There were a lot of people arguing, all I want to do is have a bunch of generics along with the country codes so that we could try different things. Do you want, okay, yeah. Moderator.
So looking at zone files, I always feel it's like one thing that I never had, and again, that everybody go look it up, and it's like, all right, it's that. So the one thing, the internet class, essentially, what are the actual uses you've seen for the non-internet classes? I know the one is chaos, and I think there were a couple of them, but what are those actually used for?
Let me repeat the question just for the live stream. The question is, what uses do you see for the non-internet classes?
Yeah, well, there was a bunch of fill-in-the-blank stuff in the original specification where this was sort of room to grow and to meet perceived needs. So let's see, we can talk about the classes, we can talk about why is there a count for the query field. There's several of these. The class thing was originally there because people thought that there might be, or at least I thought, there might be different authorities for information about a specific name. So that, for example, the phone companies might choose to associate phone numbers with the name, and they would do it in a class that was separate from the one where you would specify your internet addresses and so forth. So it was room to grow. The original definition said that the namespaces were supposed to be the same, although clearly they could have been different if you wanted to. So it was just something that did get used. Although today, now that we have Yeti, which is sort of a parallel namespace with supposedly the same names, it's like a new use for the class field. Yeah.
Absolutely.
One last question. So why do you hate underscore so much?
What?
Why do you hate underscore so much?
The question is, why do you hate underscore?
No, ask him.
Paul, do you want to answer?
So, problem with underscore is the context that these names are used in. It gets us in trouble. So keep in mind, in 1995, there was a CERT advisory having to do with SendMail, which took the result of a get host by adder call, which would return the host name from a PTR record. Take that and put it straight into a control file in varspool MQ. And if there was a new line in the middle of it, then it was whatever followed that new line in the PTR value became another line in the control file, which could specify things like what UID it should run as and where the response ought to go if there's an error, for example, piping to bin SH, and so forth. And so we did not so much say that underbar was bad. What we said is we can't fix SendMail as quickly as we can fix the resolver. So we're just going to make the resolver the negative pressure. In other words, instead of saying what's disallowed, we're going to constrain it to only that which is allowed. So that was host names and mail names. And basically, if it wasn't allowed in SMTP to be a mail name, then it could not be the owner of an MX record in that particular zone file parser. And there were similar rules coming from RFC 952, the old hosts.txt, about what can be a host name and so forth. So theoretically, you could imagine that underbar was an assignment operator in some shell you never heard of, and that allowing this in there would allow the backtick operator in that shell to insert some kind of assignment because the DNS was 8-bit clean other than case folding. And so, as much as we'd like to have been liberal in what we accepted, it was killing us, so we had to stop. Thank you.
I don't even need a mic for this. So, okay, this is like the SQL injection attack philosophy. And so what it's saying is that in order to improve the security of people that can't digest names properly, what we'll do is we'll tell everybody not to take those names. Now, of course, the evil people that are running their own name servers might not get the message about that. And it just pollutes the original. I just hate this kind of stuff. There's some ugly hacks that are really wonderful, but this wasn't one of them. Luckily, Microsoft freed us from the underscore. How do you feel about the rest of the alphabet? No, never mind. No, this was I was never against the underscore. In fact, I think I had a free the underscore t-shirt once upon a time.
I saw another hand. Yes.
How do you feel about coupling DNS with blockchain technologies? Do you see any potential in that?
The question is about DNS and blockchain. Is there a potential to couple the two?
Yeah, there's already been a couple of implementations. I spent a year being a consultant for ICANN about strategic things. And one of the things I suggested is that we can use blockchain technology to replace the managers of some zone or another, with an algorithm using blockchain. And that all of a sudden we could have fairness in management without necessarily having all these people in the loop. So I think there's a lot of different applications that you could think of, and there's several people out there that are already doing things.
Cool, let's take 2 more questions. Just kidding, let's take no more questions.
Going to go back on your script. No.
What are your thoughts on DNS as being like a symbol for freedom in opposition to regimes that want to clamp down on the internet? During the Arab Spring, there were people like wrote 8.8.8.8 on walls just to have people know how to be able to get out.
The question is, how do you feel about DNS being a symbol for freedom for oppressive regimes?
Well, people always ask me, did you ever think it would be used for that? And I guess I'll say I didn't think that. One of the reasons that I wanted to distribute control to different countries and so forth is that it was pretty clear that different countries would have different regimes and enforcements of things. So having the generics might mean that people would be able to get a name even if their country didn't feel like giving one to them. So, I think it's been helpful to that, but 8.8.8 doesn't necessarily solve all the problems.
Cool, I've been told to wrap this up, so let's do a speed round.
Okay.
First question is, you're cool? Okay. What are your concerns about the future of DNS? What, if anything, needs to change?
I would like to think about whether or not we could clean up some of the arbitrary rules that have been put on it by people who have done shortcuts like, well, I hate to say like the underscore, but things like that. I think it'd be interesting to try and figure out what kind of extensions we could do, whether or not there's some way to clean it up. It's like Apple famously got rid of the floppy disk in their computer, and I keep wondering whether or not it's possible to think about a new simplified version for some of the stuff that's going on in DNS, because it always seems like every edition comes with unpleasant hair. So cleaning it up a little bit, maybe there will actually be a better way to do security. Maybe we can think about how to do access control, and maybe we can think about how to get much larger packets. Life would be so much easier if datagrams had just scaled. I mean, if only we had said, a packet can be up to a microsecond long, life would be so much better. We could fit our digital signatures in the packets, right? I mean, when people ask me, what surprises you? This fact that 512 is still, 576 is still a significant number. Thank you, Barbara. And it hasn't scaled.
Are there any alternatives to DNS that you find plausible?
There's a bunch of alternatives, and somebody will invent DNS 2.0 or eDNS or Zorfcan, whatever they're going to call it. You know, all technology is, you know, has a lifetime. We don't know what the TTL of DNS is. It's certainly been larger than a lot of people have predicted to date. But, you know, if you want to be famous 100 years from now, don't do an addition to DNS, write music, because Mozart will be around in 200 years, but probably not DNS.
Is it even viable today to replace DNS?
You know, progress doesn't stop. You know, I hate to sound like I'm from, what's that dinosaur movie? You know, nature will find a way. You know, I mean, you know, the heroes of the internet will find a way, and some of them are out there, you know.
Cool. Now we can do a speed round.
Okay.
First question is Vim or Emacs?
What?
Vim or Emacs?
You mean buy, but at any rate. Actually, I was an R mode user, then an Emacs user.
Amazing. What is the funniest thing you've ever done with DNS?
I had somebody ask me whether it's helped me pick up dates.
Has it?
We'll see.
Okay. What was the first website you built?
A21.com.
Programming language of choice?
I don't know. I'm looking for a new one.
Favorite domain that you own?
A21.com.
And then last question, why is there a question section, a question count, but always only one question?
Well, I didn't think there would always be one question. I thought that what people would do is that they would have particular names that had a large number of alternatives, and so the question section would be built up with one entry that would specify what the name was you were looking for, and a second one that would specify like a filter. So it could be like a regex and return everything at that name that meets this type that filters through this, or something that where you would build up something like an expression to be evaluated that's the query that was in there. You know, I tend to think that we would have been better if somebody had found that an interesting thing to do, but it didn't happen.
Cool. Do we have time for questions? Yeah?
I have one question. You know, over the years, we've expanded the number of record types to like SSH fingerprints and things like that. Do you think there are any like new types that you would like to see added, or if there are any types like SSH fingerprints that you think are detrimental to the system?
The question is, are there any record types that do not exist that you would like to see?
I don't have any to suggest here. There's a bunch of them that are obsolete, and some of them that were defined poorly. You know, the original ones for mail routing didn't work out, and then the MX records worked out, and sort of this, you know, the SRV records are sort of son of that, and there's been an evolution of that. I still don't quite know whether or not NAPTR was meant to be. It seems almost a little bit too complicated for its own good.
Well, so it seems like increasingly people are wanting less TTL and they want the DNS propagation to happen instantly. What was the thinking behind TTL when like doing DNS, and did you anticipate people wanting instant DNS in the future?
The question is, why? What was the thinking behind TTL?
The thinking behind TTL was just to, you know, allow you to control the caching behavior in a very coarse way so that you could improve the performance of the whole thing. Remember that the root servers back when we started had a capacity of doing about 100 queries a second running flat out. And that was just because of the speeds of the communications link, not because of the processor. So, you know, being able to cache enabled the system to scale. Now, of course, you know, the parameters of everything have changed over the years. I don't know. You know, maybe we should have moved the decimal point over one. Instead of having seconds, it should have been in tenths of seconds. But then, you know, there's all these smart people in this building who don't pay attention to the TTLs they get anyways, right?
Something that's essentially like translating binary name or binary data into human readable names and like surprise readable, and it's taking so long for DNS to like really start supporting non-Latin American precision names.
What is the question?
Things that can really submit jurors about that no one else cares about, like international domain seem to have like not that much adoption, but it seems like kind of surprising to me that like kept so long using this like Latin script or whatever, so it's essentially supposed to be human readable name or binary data.
Yeah, I mean, basically the question is international domain names, why is it taking so long, why is it so hard, and blah, blah, blah. And part of that is that people tried to say, well, we're going to have a coding scheme that's so clever that it avoids the ambiguity between what those round things are that are dots and what the round things are that aren't dots, and so forth. There's a bunch of that ambiguity that's just very hard to get out no matter what you do. And so people are going to be struggling against that forever. Okay, so like for example, if I own a21.com, my favorite domain, should I own AXAQ21? You know, I mean, there's just a lot of problems around doing that. And the whole business about the encoding was, I think, more complicated than it had to be because people thought that they were going to solve a lot of ambiguity problems that eventually they broke their pick on, although they'll say, well, we solved a lot of them. So it's the ambiguity problems. I think that there's actually, I've heard people tell me that there's, more domain names that are not in Roman characters now than are. So we could argue that it's really had a big uptake. It seems like it could be true. Seems like it's likely to be true. I haven't counted them.
What's the future of the root servers look like?
The future of the root servers.
Frankly, my bet noir has been that what we can do is we can figure out how to distribute the root zone rather than the root servers. So there's this whole business about how you have 13 hard targets that the bad guys are going to take down. Yeah, I know it's not really 13 because there's lots of replication and so forth, but it is still a fixed defense. Whereas if I say, okay, you, Mr. Big Company, get your own private copy of the root, and if the root servers are down, you won't care because you have your own. So I think that there's a lot of DNS security that we could do by just replicating DNS data at the zone basis, and so that we don't have to worry about having access to some of these things, particularly the root, because I think it's a little more energy in distributing copies of the root zone as opposed to having more roots and tweaking more routing systems and so forth would be a better way to security. And you should be able to apply it to other things. So I frequently tell companies what you should be able to do is to have your DNS set up so that you can continue to run internally regardless of what ICANN or anybody else on the outside does. You can be internally self-sufficient. This was supposed to be a speed round, but I'm talking too long.
You said that the DNS set was only complex. It's one thing you take out.
The question is, DNSSEC is very complicated. What is the one thing that you would take out?
Authoritative non-existence. Get over it.
Amazing. Yes?
You mentioned that you were working towards some kind of protocol when you were building DNS, but this is where you can fill me in. This was before RFCs, I believe, when you were building DNS. So what protocol were you building for? Who gave it to you?
Yeah, the question here was, weren't you building DNS before RFCs? And let me just straighten out a little bit of the history, because you might have been, for example, if you go on the web and you say, okay, I want to know about the DNS, the page that you probably hit explains about how DNS was invented by the IETF in 1983. And if you went somewhere else, you would find out that the IETF was invented in 1986, and you might have some trouble parsing that. And then there's another one about how, John Postel invented the DNS, and I somehow slipped the RFCs by him, and he was the RFC editor at the time, and he didn't notice that I had taken his name off and put my name on. So there's a bunch of that history. The facts are that the RFCs existed long before 1983 or whatever it was. I think RFC1 was done by Steve Crocker, I believe. I'm not sure. And I think it was in the 70s. But at any rate, the RFC series had been running before the DNS. The DNS came out in the RFCs. And the IETF came into existence sometime later and adopted it as a standard. The original DNS code that I wrote was set up so that it would also run on the ARPANET, but then on January 1st of 1983, we basically turned off the ARPANET, so it's gone. Although there's some bizarre code that some people still have lying around about preferred net 10, which used to be the ARPANET, but you know, at any rate.
Any? Cool. Oh, yeah. Retry.
What was the price of the domain at the beginning?
How much did a domain cost at first?
Well, SRI was originally registering them for free. SRI was funded to do this and had a staff of about 3 people to register the host table. And the way we got the DNS going is I wrote a program that would just eat the host table every day and create zone files, adding .ARPA at the end and stuff like that. So that went on for a while, and then we said, okay, now you can have names in the DNS that aren't in the host table. So eventually it got to be more capable than the host table, and it was registered by the same 3 people at SRI. As the system expanded and more people, SRI, I think at the end had a staff of like 26 people that were in charge of handling registrations for the DNS and other stuff. And they were funded by the Department of Defense, who said, excuse me, why are we paying to register symbolics.com and why are we hiring that all out? And so NSF took it over, and they were still registering .edus and stuff for free, and then one day decided to let the contractor charge. And at that point, I was in the government, and I said, you guys are nuts. You should turn this over to FCC or the Department of Commerce or somebody who's used to dealing with vendors in an adversarial way. Because you, NSF, I'm sorry, they're just going to take you to the cleaners, and they did. So that's when, NSF made the decision to start allowing the charging, and away we went.
Amazing. Any last questions? Cool. Paul, we can't thank you enough. This was really amazing.
All right.
A little bit of swag.
All right, swag.
A bottle of water. Bottle of wine. Nobody wants water. Wine.
Pinot Noir.
Called flowers. We hope that you planting this will flower into something else.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
I was hoping that you would want to reshboard me into something else. Never mind.
Yeah, and we have shirts and things for all of you too, so on your way out you should pick some up. And really quickly before you go, we have 2 really cool speakers coming up next. In next month, we have Dan Kaminsky. There's a DNS attack named after him, the Kaminsky attack. He made DNSSEC important. And then after that is Paul Vixie, who you heard from about underscores. Cool, thank you.